Fiscal Reform to Benefit State and Local Governments. The Modern Money Theory Approach by L. Randall Wray. Introduction. What is modern money theory? Over the past quarter century, a small group of researchers has developed an approach to macroeconomic theory and policy that has come to be called modern money theory, MMT. Footnote 1. It is also called modern monetary theory. The first academic monograph introducing the approach was Understanding Modern Money, The Key to Full Employment and Price Stability by L. Randall Wray, 1998. The three main research institutions that developed MMT are the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability, University of Missouri, Kansas City; the Center of Full Employment and Equity, University of Newcastle, Australia; and the Levy Economics Institute, Bard College. End footnote. It is based on several traditions that are part of the heterodox approach to economics. That is, followers of J.M. Keynes, Keynesianism, Thorstein Veblen, institutionalist, and Karl Marx, Marxist. In particular, it builds on Keynes's theory of effective demand from the General Theory, 1936, independently developed by Marx, Keynes's theory of the nature of money from his Treatise on Money, 1930, which followed G.F. Knapp's State Theory of Money, 1973, the monetary theory of production adopted by Keynes, Veblen, and Marx, Wynne Godley's sectoral balance approach, the endogenous money approach resurrected in the 1980s by post-Keynesians, Abba Lerner's functional finance approach to budgeting, and the financial instability approach of Hyman Minsky. Footnote 2. See Ray, 1990, for a history of the theory of endogenous money. End footnote. A key policy proposal is the job guarantee, also developed by Minsky. MMT has been devoted to the study of the processes involved with when government spends, and is particularly critical of orthodox theories and policy recommendations. MMT argues that budgeting by national sovereign governments that issue their own currency must be analyzed as quite different from budgeting by other economic units, such as households, firms, or local governments. Although it is common to apply a household analogy to government spending, quote, "If I ran my household like Uncle Sam runs his, I'd go bankrupt," end quote. This is false. Households and other non-sovereign entities need to earn income, borrow, or sell assets before spending. They must obtain means of payment to service debt or become insolvent and be forced into bankruptcy. They must pay back debts at some point. Even at death, creditors can lodge claims against assets to cover debts. They are subject to credit ratings and can be denied loans. And, taken as a whole, non-sovereign entities face various adding up constraints, the paradox of thrift, problems of insufficiency of aggregate demand, and the liquidity trap, long staples of Keynesian macroeconomics. Footnote 3. We won't go through these except to give one example. Entities hold liquid assets to sell to obtain means of payment in case of emergencies. But if everyone is trying to sell them, the liquidity disappears. So even liquid assets cannot be a source of finance in what Irving Fisher called a debt deflation. End footnote. A sovereign government's finances are quite different. MMT defines currency sovereignty as follows. The sovereign government chooses a money of account and imposes taxes and other obligations, fees, fines, issues currency, and issues its own obligations all in that unit. To maximize policy space, the sovereign does not peg its currency's exchange rate to foreign currency or precious metals, and does not issue obligations in foreign currency. The main implications include 1. The sovereign issues its currency before collecting it in taxes. 2. The sovereign cannot run out of its own currency. 3. The sovereign can always make all payments as they come due in its own currency. 4. The sovereign never needs to borrow its own currency before spending. 5. If the sovereign issues debt in its own currency, it can choose the interest rate it will pay. 6. The sovereign can always financially afford to pay anything that is for sale in its own currency. 7. The sovereign never needs to pay back, retire, its debt. And 8. While there is no affordability constraint, sovereign spending faces real resource constraints, and if it spends too much, this can cause inflation and possibly affect exchange rates. Each of these has been examined in detail by MMT scholars, so they will only be briefly summarized here, with some further elaboration later in this paper. From inception, a sovereign cannot collect its own currency in tax payment without first issuing it. Since it has a monopoly on issue, the currency cannot come from any other source. While currency can be lent into existence, the most common way to provide it is through spending, as sovereign governments either stamped coins or printed paper notes that were issued as they spent. The currency returned to the government when taxes were paid. Paper notes were often burned on receipt of taxes. Coins could be reissued or melted down for new coinage. As it happens, the American colonies were among the first big users of paper money in the Western world. Grubb 2017. Every time an act authorized issuing paper notes to be spent, they also imposed what they called a redemption tax, any related bill to remove the notes from circulation. It was obvious that no notes could be collected in taxes until they were spent. There is also a Keynesian logic involved. Government spending is an injection into the circular flow that creates income to finance leakages such as saving, imports, and tax payments. This became obscured after the Fed's creation, shifting to payments made through reserve credits rather than paper notes. But the logic remains the same. Reserves cannot be debited for tax payments until they've been created. And the main way that reserves are created is in payments made by the Fed on behalf of the Treasury. Just as the colonial notes had to exist before they could be redeemed in tax payment, we need the means of tax payment, bank reserves, today before taxes can be paid. Modern governments do not usually spend notes and coins into the economy. They issue currency only to meet the demand, usually when households and businesses convert bank deposits to cash. Rather, payments from and to the Treasury are now handled by coordination between private banks and the central bank. The currency created by government spending is now central bank reserves, deposits held by private banks at the central bank. Reserves are not included in the usual definition of currency, coins and central bank notes. But for all practical purposes, they are perfectly suitable for currency at par. Further, like paper money, reserves are central bank liabilities that are denominated in the state money of account. Reserves can be created by central bank lending and by central bank open market purchases. But outside of the recent experiments in quantitative easing, QE, most reserves are created when the Treasury spends. A sovereign government cannot run out of currency, whether it takes the form of coins, paper money, or electronic reserve entries on the central bank's balance sheet. The major central banks demonstrated this fact with quantitative easing, as they keystroked trillions of dollars, euros, and yen as payment for large-scale asset purchases. Clearly, they could just as easily keystroke reserves to banks to allow the Treasury to spend. Some critics wrongly characterize MMT as a call for turning government spending over to the central banks to, quote, print money, end quote, to pay for spending. Footnote 4. There has recently been an explosion of critics accusing MMT of this policy recommendation, from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, Cox 2019, to Bank of Japan Policy Board member Yutaka Harada, Nikkei 2019. See Wray 2019 for a summary and response to some of the critics. End footnote. This is not correct. Modern procedures already require that central banks credit bank reserves dollar for dollar or yen for yen as the Treasury spends. Footnote 5. We see Ray 1998, Bell 2000, Fulwiler 2011, and Timon 2014 for discussion of modern procedures summarized also in Ray 2015. End footnote. The Treasury issues checks or increasingly handles payments electronically, and the central bank simply handles clearing, which takes the form of reserve credits to private banks. The central bank also provides reserves to handle clearing between banks. At the same time, the central bank debits the Treasury's account. From the central bank's perspective, it is clearing accounts, not creating money to pay for Treasury spending. However, unless the central bank is going to start bouncing Treasury checks, reserves are created dollar for dollar with Treasury spending. Until MMT investigated the procedures used, it was not clear how the Treasury ensures it has sufficient deposits to be debited by the central bank as the Treasury spends. This requires close coordination between the central bank, Treasury, and private banks. The Treasury obtains credits through tax receipts and bond sales. However, from inception, taxpayers and bond purchasers do not have currency or reserves today to pay taxes or buy bonds unless the government has already provided it. And according to the Keynesian logic, households and firms do not have the income to pay taxes or save, buy bonds, unless the government has injected spending. Logically, the currency creation through spending comes first. But how can the Treasury spend first, since it needs deposits at the central bank to avoid bouncing checks? Central banks are generally prohibited from providing overdrafts, although they almost certainly do provide them for at least short periods. The proof is that Treasury checks are never returned due to insufficient funds. Footnote 6. Note that as this is a self-imposed rule, it can be eliminated, which would push the Fed to allow overdrafts, which amounts to the same thing as directly buying bonds from the Treasury. End footnote. Hence, they worked out procedures to ensure that the Treasury obtains deposits through sales of bonds that are purchased by banks using either overdrafts or borrowed reserves supplied by the central bank. This serves effectively as an end run around the no Treasury overdraft rule. Once the Treasury spends, bank reserves are replenished. If banks don't want to hold bonds, they can be sold to the central bank in secondary markets. However, banks normally do not want excess reserves created by government spending, so they willingly exchange them for higher interest-earning bonds. A key insight of MMT is that bond sales by the Treasury or the central bank are functionally equivalent operations. Footnote 7. Warren Mosler was the first to understand the full significance of this. He developed his understanding while trading sovereign bonds for his hedge fund. See his book, Soft Currency Economics. End footnote. The conventional view is that Treasury sales are a borrowing operation, while central bank sales are an open market operation. But in either case, the functional impact is to withdraw reserves from banks. Government spending puts reserves into the banking system, and the reserves can only leave the system through bond purchases, tax payments, or cash withdrawals from deposits. Cash withdrawals are normally small, with seasonal variability. National government taxes are large, but with temporal variation, and are usually, for most countries, significantly lower than sovereign government spending. To avoid wide fluctuations of reserves and to deal with net reserve accumulation due to government spending in excess of tax payments as well, the central bank and Treasury coordinate bond sales to drain excess reserves. For this reason, MMT sees bond sales as part of monetary policy operations, whether undertaken by the central bank or by the Treasury. Warren Mosler calls bonds an interest rate maintenance account, held at the central bank to emphasize the functional impact of bond sales. Footnote 8. See Wray, 1998. End footnote. When a bond is sold, reserves are debited and bond holdings are credited. Because both of these accounts are held at the central bank, this is a transfer from a checking account, reserves, to a savings account, bonds, to earn more interest. Generally, the central bank's overnight interest rate target, the Fed funds rate in the United States, is higher than the rate paid on reserves. The Fed paid 0 on reserves until recently when it began to pay a support rate, and it uses sovereign bonds as the instrument to hit the target. The shortest maturity Treasury debt serves as the alternative to bank lending of reserves in the overnight market, the Fed funds market in the U.S., and its rate is set by policy. Rates on other maturities are more complexly determined, although expectations of central bank policy play an important role. In any event, the central bank can set the rate on any maturity by announcing it stands ready to buy bonds at the announced price equivalent. Note also that the distribution among maturities is a policy decision, referred to as debt management. This means both the interest rate on and the composition of government debt is under the control of the government. While there is a widespread fear that bond vigilantes can drive rates up through a strike, that is unlikely and easily countered by government policy. In the United States, for example, dealer banks are required to place bids for treasuries sold at auction. Before the auction, the Treasury surveys preferences over maturities to offer what the market wants. The Fed cooperates with banks to ensure they can obtain the reserves they need to buy bonds. Footnote 9. After quantitative easing, banks have plenty of reserves so that no further intervention is needed as bonds are sold. End footnote. The Treasury maintains special accounts at private banks to temporarily deposit proceeds from bond sales and from tax receipts, then shifts them to the Fed to meet the projected clearing of government payments. The U.S. Treasury usually faces a demand for securities that exceeds the supply, often by a large margin. The question is not whether the Treasury can sell enough, but rather at what price, interest rate, and it often tries to minimize interest expenses by offering the maturities desired. Using current procedures, there is no questioning the ability to pay all promised interest due by cutting a check or making electronic payments that will be cleared by the Fed. Furthermore, the Treasury doesn't have to issue any bonds, as rules can be changed to allow overdrafts at the Fed. In that case, the Fed can still maintain a non-zero interest rate target by paying interest on reserves, as it has done since the global financial crisis, rather than using bonds as the interest-earning alternative to keep the Fed funds rate up in the presence of excess reserves. Normal Fed operating procedure ensures banks always get the reserves they need to buy bonds, which allows the Treasury to get the deposits it needs in its account at the Fed. Further, as discussed, dealer banks must submit reasonable bids for bond tenders or risk sanctioning and lose the right to deal in the most coveted financial asset in the world, U.S. Treasury debt. Treasury bond sales are thus quite different from borrowing by households, firms, and local and state governments, an issue to which we turn in the next section. What MMT research has shown is that affordability is not a legitimate concern for the sovereign government. It can finance its spending and meet all obligations as they come due. It has substantial control over interest rates and does not face a market full of vigilantes who can strike for higher rates. Even if it did, the government can exert control over its central bank. The Fed, after all, is a creature of Congress, subject to the Federal Reserve Act, as amended several times over the years. Economists have developed strange arguments defending what is supposed to be an inviolable principle of central bank independence. But in fact, in trying times, such as both world wars, the Fed has been placed under the Treasury in pursuit of the public interest to keep rates low as government spending expanded to 50% of GDP. Finally, nothing in this section should be interpreted to mean either that real resource constraints should be ignored, or that too much spending would not cause inflation. Further, increasing government spending can mean that too few real resources are left for the private sector's use. Since the government can always win a bidding war, it needs to be careful to target its spending toward sectors with excess capacity and toward resources that are not fully utilized. Otherwise, it can cause inflationary pressures even before resources are fully employed, particularly if its spending competes in the more advanced sectors that are highly unionized with skilled workers and oligopolized employers with pricing power. This was believed to be a real problem at the end of the 1960s with what was dubbed military Keynesianism, which kept aggregate demand high by pumping government spending into the defense and aerospace sectors. Although excessive demand has not been a problem in the United States since then, MMT does not ignore real resource constraints.